I've been a Halo fan since the original, and since 343 Industries took over the Halo franchise, I haven't been the biggest fan. But is missing co-op and the Forge as big of a deal as it would seem? Well, let's take a look. Hey, I'm Sam with Busy Dad Gaming. I help busy dads figure out what games to play on Xbox and PC so they can relax and go back to their families recharged. Today's video is going to be a bit more off the cuff and more commentary-ish, so I'll try to keep the rambling to a minimum. But with recent news here that 343 Industries broke that co-op and the Forge would be missing for launch, I want to chime in because I feel that there's an echo chamber happening and I want to make sure to add a different perspective so that way you get multiple viewpoints as opposed to just the singular one that you may or may not be getting today. To be clear, it does suck that Halo Infinite will not have co-op or Forge at launch. Now, how you feel about those two missing features doesn't negate the way that you actually feel. If it irritates you, if it's something that you don't really care about, however you're feeling, you are allowed to feel the way that you feel. So don't let anybody actually negate the way that you feel about something, happening or not happening. But let's look at this from a different perspective for a moment and some of the factors that may have played into co-op and Forge coming at a later date. Bungie really did a great job with the Halo franchise before handing it off to 343. The original trilogy along with Reach were some great games. They had great story. There was a lot of great gameplay. You had multiplayer, co-op, you had the Forge eventually. Now when 343 Industries took over the Halo franchise, Halo 4 was just meh in my opinion, but it did at least have the co-op and I'm not really sure if it had Forge or not. I didn't dive into that area of it. Now, Halo 5 was even worse. I didn't think that could actually happen, but locked. Really, I don't really need to say more about that. So the story itself wasn't all that great. Again, it did have at least co-op and it had Forge roughly about a year later from what I understand. But Halo 5 did have co-op limitations when it originally launched. Halo 4 and 5 did have a lot of ancillary media along with them. So you had podcasts, you had books, you had all these different things. And the Hunt the Truth podcast was actually really cool. And surprisingly, it had a better story than Halo 5 did. So go figure that one. But what this really means is that when 343 took over Halo, things have been relatively rocky since. Now, Bungie kept things relegated to the video games themselves for the most part. Now, 343 has taken a different approach where you have the video games, you have books, you have podcasts, you have all these different mediums to help tell these stories. And so the games themselves may or may not have had the best story as a result. And so this has really led to 343 kind of branching off into those different arenas and potentially taking less time away from the games to really deliver the best experience. And so with Halo Infinite, I'm sure it's run into its fair share of issues with this as well, and hopefully they've kind of relegated things more tightly to where the video game is telling the story that they want to tell. Now, I'm sure people leaving mid-development is obviously not helping the issue, and then you also have the technologies themselves, so the slipstream engine and getting used to those technologies and what you can and cannot do. All of these things are leading into Halo Infinite having struggles of things not being delivered in the timelines that they're wanting it to be delivered in. So what this does is it really sets the stage of some of the challenges that 343 has come under here recently, and me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of them either, so I'm not, for or against them at this particular point, but I'd like to approach why Halo Infinite is not being delayed. And here's a few points from more of a product management perspective, because that is my day job. There are a few things to keep in mind when it comes to co-op and Forge being deprioritized. So the first thing is Sony is basically AWOL right now for the holiday season this year, and it would be asinine if Microsoft didn't take advantage of that in some way. Now, keep in mind, this is purely a business perspective, but again, Xbox has the opportunity to drive the narrative for the next 3 to 6 months because, again, Sony doesn't have any big party titles coming out within that time frame. And so Halo has the opportunity to do that and to not only shift the narrative, but also drive console sales even more than they already have. So from a business perspective, I'm sure this was a crucial point and a more relatively newer point, but something that we have to keep in mind nonetheless. Now, the second thing I'm going to bring up is if you're on a time box delivery date, you have to prioritize ruthlessly. I'm sure the team was given a Q4 date to deliver, and the Sony item I mentioned previously was definitely an added bonus, but now I'm sure 343 knew that co-op and Forge were struggling to be delivered and presented additional issues, and because of this, my guess is they deprioritized these features and shifted people over to the campaign and multiplayer to ensure that they actually ship this holiday season. Now, when you're prioritizing this way, you have to limit the impact to the least amount of people possible. And so in this particular case, you're looking at the co-op and the Forge, I'm guessing, are the least amount used within the Halo game. So in this case, campaign and multiplayer, I'm pretty sure are the most utilized features for this game. And so they shifted people over to make sure that those things were actually done. And the co-op and the Forge were deprioritized to then be able to assess them at a later date and then start, once multiplayer and campaign were more in a finished state, start shifting people back to start to deliver those particular features. And then after all that stuff is done, now you have 343 going through and doing some damage control because they set expectations that co-op and Forge were going to be there at launch, and now they're having to roll that back. And so they're having to do some damage control to reset expectations, which is difficult to do. And third and lastly is a change in leadership. And whenever you change leadership, there is going to be inherent change in priorities and a potential decrease in the amount of things that may or may not be delivered. And so what one person was championing may not be the same thing somebody else would. So this creates a potential dichotomy because you have what's being built with the staff that you have, and then you have this new vision coming in that may or may not be in direct contrast to it. So the change in leadership, I'm guessing, was one of those where things were dragging on. And so somebody was brought in to go ahead and clean things up and hit a particular date. And then the prioritization came in of, well, what can we deliver in this time frame? And if anything was outside of that time frame, it started to get cut. And so that may have been potential cut content. It could have been potential cut features. You just start to minimize the amount of stuff that you can actually deliver within that particular time frame. So these are the things that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at Halo is not going to launch with these particular features, and it does suck. It does. But if they're trying to hit a particular date, they did have to start stripping things out to hit that particular date. So ultimately, Halo Infinite is not going to be delayed. I don't see that happening, regardless of whether people are missing co-op and Forge or not. I just don't see that happening. Now, 343 does continue to make missteps here, and at the end of the day, what will really matter is whether Halo Infinite is actually good or not. If Halo Infinite at its core is not good, then it won't really matter if co-op and Forge were delayed. The game is going to be DOA, just dead on arrival. And that's the challenge that they're most likely trying to run into right now and try to make it their way through it. So if the campaign and the multiplayer are in fact awesome, which I'm truly hoping that they are, then the discussion becomes, should we revisit the campaign to play co-op with our friends if we already played it? And then the Forge is more of a long-term play. Forge is something that, people use for, 5-10 years at this point. So only time will really tell, but make sure to watch the video that's coming up for you next, and I'll see you in the coming videos.